landlord.co.uk. Thank you very much for joining us on the webinar this evening on what pitfalls to avoid and what steps you should take. Before we begin, just an introduction to those people that don't know me. I've been a landlord for the last 16 years. I've got properties in northwest London and in Swansea. And it was off the back of being a landlord that I decided to launch Upad nearly 5-6 years ago. And in the last 12 months we've let just over 5,500 properties. But the most interesting thing from my perspective is that we've generated over 220,000 tenant inquiries during that time, which has given us some real useful insights on the pitfalls that people should try and avoid and what things work. And it was off the back of all of this that we decided to do a series of webinars over the last few months or so. And tonight's one is we're going to talk about the pitfalls and how to avoid them. And the first one that I wanted to look at was setting the rent as high as you possibly can, and the myth that by doing so we're maximising the amount of rent that we can earn while we're renting out a particular property. And arguably, why should we not set the rent as high as you possibly can? Because we want to maximise our revenues, etc. And I think the reason why we used to have this myth in my mind is that it was hard to put up the rent further down the line. You can't, if you can start it at a high price, obviously you're sort of better. There's an argument that there's many tenants today looking for every property. There's generally sort of 3 or 4 tenants, arguably, for every rental property. So there's an argument that you can afford to put the rent as high as we can. There's the belief that if we put rent as high as we could, we would attract the best quality tenants too, and clearly we're maximising the yield that we're going to earn on the property. And we're also reading in the newspaper, obviously, that rents are on the increase, and they're up to 5-6% over the course of this year. But I think there's a difference between setting the rent at the highest amount you possibly could and the myths that are associated with that, and that it's more about setting the rent at the right rental price, and that we will be better off by doing so. And when I say setting the rent at the right price, there's a few things that I think are worth considering. Firstly, creating an alert on Rightmove or Zoopla will give us a really good steer for what is happening in our locality. Creating an alert allows you to put your postcode in, number of bedrooms and price range, and it will give us a steer of what is happening in our locality, so we understand what is happening with prices and also whether we're competing with 1 or 25 other properties in our area. It will give us a really good steer about how competitive that space is. I think having a good price is all about creating a good value tenant. Yes, we want to earn as much as we can for every property we rent out, but we also want a good tenant that's going to treat the place as a home, not as a stopgap, and ideally stay for as long as we possibly can. So yes, we want to earn good. I think the internet has changed the way that tenants are able to understand what the market value is. When tenants are doing a search on sites like Rightmove and Zoopla, there's so much information there for them to understand what is the right rent for a particular property and what is excessive. And so arguably you could be pricing yourself out of the market by putting the rent too high, because tenants can far more easily see what a fair price is compared to 5-6 years ago, for example. I think there's an argument that we as landlords should be cautious about those tenants that are prepared to pay anything. Indeed, wanting to pay 6 months up front, and it should come with a warning sign about, are these the type of people we want to have in our property? Is there, is there something just doesn't sit right with us, and why we maybe should not take them on? And I think also it's not just about getting the highest rent you can, it's more about looking at your overall income over the course of the year, taking into account any voids that you may get. And so if we think that we could rent out our property for 52 weeks of the year, if we set the rent, for argument's sake, of £420, but maybe we could achieve 500, but it might lead to 6 weeks of void periods, we should do the maths over what the annual rent would be and what ideally we should be setting our rent at to maximise the rental in our property, rather than trying to earn as much as we can but also attracting a high amount of voids during the same bit. So that was the first myth. The second thing I wanted to look at is whether we as landlords should consider furnishing our properties or not, and is this something that is worth the hassle, or whether it just creates more work for us as landlords. It would just be really good to do a poll, and for you guys just to sort of select what you see as preferable from your perspective, and do you think that you should be doing furnished properties, or do you think that you do unfurnished is better because you just don't want the hassle, or somewhere in the middle as far as part furnished? So it'd be great if you can select one of the three options there of what generally applies across your portfolio, and what you do in the main, whether you do the fully furnished or the unfurnished route. It'd be good to get a quick steer on that. So as we can sort of see, we've got the majority of you going for the unfurnished, which is really interesting, and it'd be good actually across the country. I think we've got like just under 300 people that are tuned in right now. It'd be maybe next time it'd be good to look at whether that changes in terms of metropolitan areas versus sort of in more rural areas. But if we go back to the slides, and the reason why I wanted to do this poll and just get a steer about what you guys are doing is I think there's the belief about why furnished properties are more hassle is that you should be doing an inventory to keep on top of the state that the property is in, whether the sofas are brand new and whether there's been any damage. There's an argument that deposit schemes are favoured in the weight of tenants, and it's more likely to agree with what tenants say at the end of a tenancy if there isn't inventory. There's an argument that if you are furnishing the property, it's just something else that's going to get damaged and it's a bit more wear and tear that we've got to deal with. And an argument that most people have got their own furniture. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is increasingly I as a landlord have been renting properties out with a fully furnished stance, and it'd be good when we get to sort of the Q&A bit at the end of this to have a bit of a discussion over what people think. And the reason I've been doing it is increasingly when tenants are doing viewings and seeing a property online, is the more a property looks like a show home, that they can just walk straight into and it's all prepared, the more likely they are to take it, and therefore the lower voids I have, but interestingly the higher rents I can get as well. And so a couple of things that just might be worth considering on here is that at the end of the day every property should have an inventory. Whether you're doing unfurnished or furnished, there should be an inventory. If it's unfurnished, clearly if there's marks on the wall and damage to the carpet and to the bathroom, unless you've got an inventory, it's very hard for you to be able to say what the place was like prior to the tenants moving in. This bit about tenants being motivated by how a property looks, we know that 92% of all tenants are looking online for the next rental, and increasingly on mobile. So about 55% of all the inquiries we get comes from tenants looking on phones and iPads. And when you're using mobile devices, it's all you can really see is the photographs of the property, not the description and so on. And so if you're able to present the property in a light where it's sort of got that show home look, that staged look, it's going to look far more interesting than just an empty room with magnolia walls. And that's why you're going to get more interest from tenants if it's fully furnished than if it's just an empty room. Tenants are increasingly transitional, and there's an argument that they don't actually have much furniture. Tenants across the UK are moving on average every 15 months or so, and 12 in London, and they don't have an increasing amount of stuff that they're building up in terms of sofas and what have you. And I think therefore there's an argument that landlords could put themselves in pole position by offering a furnished property. You can arguably achieve a higher rent, and we'll come on to that in a second, but you're appealing to the people that just don't have furniture. And this bit about furnishing a place is that various reports we've seen online and what we've seen from landlords advertising on Upad is that furnished properties can achieve up to 30% more rent purely because it's got that ready-to-move-in look. And so there's an argument of doing the sums. If you've got a 3-bed flat, for example, is the cost of that furniture, arguably say about £5,000, worth the investment and what uplift you will get in rents? And does that increase in rent outweigh that capital cost that you've got? and take into account lower voids that you should achieve because your property is more exciting and more interesting to move into, and therefore worth the effort. And it's worth probably just doing some sums to see whether that is worthwhile or not. And of course, HMRC, when you're doing your tax returns, and we've got, what, 6 weeks, 7 weeks left to go to get them in for the tax year ending this April, you're allowed to claim for up to 10% wear and tear. So if it's fully furnished, you can allow 10% of your annual rent to be allocated against wear and tear. So there's a tax break from that perspective. But at Upad, we're very much seeing a movement of tenants being far more transitional, far more interested and keen to rent a place when it's fully furnished because they don't have the stuff and it looks far more appealing. And so there's an argument that you will achieve a higher rent and lower voids by going down that. And it's just something to consider. The third myth I want to look at is that tenants should leave the, arrive at the property at the start of the tenancy and look after it in the same way that it has been presented to them and not change anything within it. And typically, things that we hear about are utility bills should stay with the existing provider and tenants shouldn't change either because of getting cheaper rates or because of who they were with previously, but it should stay with who they have currently. There's an argument that some landlords are against tenants putting up shelves and pictures because it just causes damage, not to redecorate, to leave the place as it is, and not to get their green fingers out and start amending the garden. And there is this belief that us as landlords that we want to get the property returned in the same condition as it was let. But I think there's a difference between allowing, wanting to get the property back in the same condition and allowing tenants to make the property a home. And there's an argument that the more tenants can make the property a home, the longer they will stay there, and therefore less voids and less tenant fine fees we have to pay, etc., and may be worth the effort. And so my recommendations that we talk about at Upad is that, at the end of the day, if a tenant wants to change energy provider, as long as they let you know, so what? It's a very small thing, so maybe we should just let them change provider. The more a rental can be seen as a home, the more they're going to stay there for a longer period of time. And we very much see that the more homely and less sterile it is, the more they're going to want to stay in that property and not move on, which is a thumbs up from our perspective. There's an argument, why would we not want a tenant to personalise or improve the property? And clearly we don't want walls painted in a gloss black paint, but if a tenant's wanting or offering to personalise it and give the place a lick of paint, why not go down that road? And I think generally what I've done in the past, as long as they've got an ability to paint or decorate, is I've generally supplied the product in terms of paint and what have you and let them get on with it and make the place more of a home for themselves. But clearly there should be a limit to what they're allowed to do, and they should sound you out before going down that road. But I think in essence where I'm coming at on here is we shouldn't sweat the small stuff. We should allow tenants to personalise the place and make it a home and not sterile, because the advantages are very much there for us, that they will stay longer and look after the place a bit more if it's seen as a home rather than a sterile environment from which they wish to live into. The fourth pitfall, I think this is 4 of 5, just so everybody's aware. But the fourth pitfall that I think very much exists in the last few years is that it's important to get your property online as quickly as you possibly can. And the quicker we can get it advertised, the more leads we're going to generate, and therefore the lower void periods that we've got. And it's just something I wanted to bring up because there is this belief historically that the quicker we get our property advertised, the faster we're going to get let, obviously. There's a belief that if there's not much interest, we can change the price, we can change the photographs that we've got, and so it's not the end of the world. But just getting it online as soon as we can is really, really important, because at the end of the day, we don't want to miss any opportunities. We want to get it let fast, which is surely in everybody's interest. And I think we very much had this belief a few years ago that we'd have a try-it-on price, where we'd advertise it for a week or two with a price that was slightly above the market rate, and if we could get it, brilliant. we got a really high rental, and then maybe drop the price down after a week or two, or something that is a bit more realistic. But I think the marketplace has changed quite dramatically, and these things aren't necessarily what us as landlords should be pursuing, because the market has changed. And in particular, the way that portals like Rightmove and Zoopla advertise properties has changed quite dramatically. The search functionality that the portals have has changed quite a lot in recent times. And the things I wanted to focus on in particular was the first impressions factor. And Rightmove and Zoopla have recently changed how properties appear in a search result. It used to be shown with the most expensive in a price range at the top of the list, but now those properties that have just been advertised appear at the top of the list. So if you are advertising your place and you just want to get it on the market as quickly as you possibly can, it's going to appear at the top of the search results in prime position when somebody sees it. Let's just say that you haven't got the photographs done yet, or your agent hasn't got the photographs done yet. It's therefore going to appear at the top of the list without any photographs, and nobody's going to really look at it. The second you get the photographs done, maybe that's a couple of days' time, it might be at the bottom of that first page, it might be on the second or the third page, and you've missed that opportunity. You don't really get a second chance like we used to get when we're advertising it. And the same applies on a price perspective. If we advertise a property, and taking my previous example, let's say £500, a try-it-on price, as in if we could get it for 500, that'd be brilliant. If we then drop the price back to 420, we're on the second or the third page of results, and there's going to be a lot of people that aren't going to see our property, and we've missed that slot. And therefore, how your property looks is probably more important at the time that you advertise it than what you're necessarily advertising it at price-wise. And it's really important that you make your property look as good as it possibly can as soon as you put it on the market, i.e. wait until you've got the photographs back, get them touched up, crop them, make them look as really good as you possibly can, rather than just getting it advertised and adding the photographs in a few days' time, because you're not going to be at the top of that first page of results. You're going to be on page 2, page 3 of the results. And so that's really important. It's a really big change in the marketplace. And the other side on the price perspective is, unless you change the price by at least 7%, your property doesn't reappear at the top of the list again. So if you change your price by less than 7%, it stays where it was, i.e. page 2 or page 3 of the results. But anything more than 7%, it goes back to the top of the list. So bear that in mind, that if you are going to change the price, it needs to be by more than that percentage, and that when you advertise it, before you press the go button, as it were, make sure it looks absolutely brilliant, because you don't get a second chance. You can't change these things further down the line. That's the biggest change that has happened this year within search. And given 92% of tenants are looking online on sites like Rightmove and Zoopla, it's really, really important that us as landlords adapt to that and think about these things rather than rushing through it all. The final myth, and we can all go and have our supper and have our evenings after this shortly, but the final one I want to look at is this idea about whether we should communicate quite frequently with our tenants, or we should just keep our distance and avoid them at all costs. So I thought it would just be useful to run a quick poll on what everybody does. And do you feel that on average you speak to your tenants on a weekly basis, monthly, or is it once a year at tenancy renewal time? It'd be great if you can select one of those options that's come up on the screen that generally applies across your portfolio, and you think seems about right from your perspective. It'd be really good to get a steer on what everybody is facing in their particular marketplace, and whether having good communications you feel is a good thing, or you should only be speaking to your tenants when there's a maintenance issue, for example. It'd be good to see the results, what's come through. Okay, fairly evenly split. That's really quite interesting. I'm quite surprised by the weekly, in terms of 8% of people on a weekly basis speaking to their tenants. I think there's a lot of either a lot of queries with leaks and damps and whatever going on, or they're very good friends of yours and meeting up on a Saturday night. But very interesting split there, I must say, across what people are doing across the country. Really, really, really interesting. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up is, and maybe this is the bit that applies to those that speak every 3 to 6 months plus, is that the more we speak to our tenants, the more they're going to ask. They're going to bring up those things of, oh, can you just fix that light switch, and oh, can we look at the rent, and all those sort of things. There's an argument that if I get close to them and speak to them quite frequently, they're going to think I'm a soft touch and sort of win me over, rather than it being arguably a business relationship between the tenant and a landlord. I think the only time tenants and landlords speak is generally when there's an issue. There is that as a thought, and therefore, if we don't speak to our tenants much, there's going to be less issues that are brought up for our attention. There's an argument that I think that tenants want to get on with their lives and not necessarily speak to their landlord. They just want to live in that property and have a quiet life and get on with things, and not have a landlord coming around on a monthly basis or just checking up and making sure everything is okay. And I think there's an argument that most of us, myself included, being a landlord is a part-time thing. I've got my main job of running Upad, and I've got other things like that occupies my time during the day, and I don't want tenants phoning me, dealing with leaks and whatever it may be during the day when I've got my day job to sort of deal with. And I think there's, for me, 3 key things as to why there is advantages for being more of an active landlord and communicating more frequently. And I would challenge some of these things that actually we should keep our distance. So for those of you that aren't communicating particularly frequently with your tenants, a couple of things to sort of bear in mind about why it may be advantageous to communicate a little bit more frequently. The first thing that we've noticed, and we did a survey over the summer across about 23,000 tenants, and it said that 9 out of 10 tenants, 90%, wanted to meet their landlord on a viewing. Now, if we put that in our advert when we're advertising the property, and we're doing it, we're going to appeal to the vast majority of tenants that want to have a relationship with us. They want to know who the person is that owns the place, to make sure they're going to keep it in a tip-top condition. So you're going to appeal to far more tenants by saying that you are actively involved in the process rather than sort of taking more of a back seat. So just consider that when you're doing viewings in terms of appealing to more tenants that are out there. I think when you do viewings, actually meeting tenants, and during the course of a tenancy, you get a much more of a gut feel factor when you meet them rather than just seeing a credit score or just over email, for example. And if we begin to understand the type of people that our tenants are, the more we're able to understand them and deal with issues going forward when we know who they are as a person, and what's going to motivate them to pay rent on time and get things fixed, and any issues that we have to deal with during the course of the year. So the more we understand our tenants rather than just having an email address or texting, the more we're able to understand and relate to them and get what we want done. And I think thirdly is the more that we deal with maintenance issues in a speedy way, it actually reduces not just the hassle but also the cost of getting these things fixed and dealt with. And so if we stick our head in the sand and don't really go around there, make sure stuff is all okay and there's no leaks, there's no damage, there's no damp and all of this stuff, and there isn't hair clogging up the bath plug, and the washing machine is being, the filter's been emptied, all of those sorts of things, if we are actively telling our tenants maybe on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, the less likely there's going to be of a hassle factor further down the line with a bigger problem attracting a higher cost. So just something to think about as we go into the Christmas break. And I think actively managing our property also ensures that rent is paid on time and that our property is looked after. A couple of tactics that I use is that the day before rent days I will send a text or an email to the tenants just as a reminder that rent is due tomorrow. If it isn't paid on that day, I'm aware of it straight away and I can speak to them and check whether there's an issue rather than wait 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month or whatever it may be, when actually that problem may have got a lot worse or just a lot harder to fix. But by being on top of things, I think it ensures that we get our rent paid on time, less hassle factor, and our property is looked after in a much better condition. And actually, surely that's a good thing from our perspective to ensure that the revenue we earn and our property is being looked after really well. So just something to consider as we go into the Christmas break. Just to summarise what we've been through, and then we've got time I think for a few questions, but the few things that we've sort of just gone through is that I think this idea of being a passive landlord and just sitting back and expecting everything to happen once the tenants have moved into a property is very much in the past, and I think it makes far more sense to be actively involved in the journey and ensuring that the property is being looked after and that our income is coming through. We talked at the beginning about setting the right rent and not maximising rent and putting it at the highest possible level. The idea of looking at what we could earn over the course of the year and maybe setting a sensible rent rather than the highest possible but might attract higher void rates. We talked also about that tenants are after a lifestyle, not a property, so the more they're able to sort of personalise the place within reason, the more likely they're going to see it as a home rather than a stopgap and look after it to a higher degree than if it's something they can't put their mark on. The more they do that, the more they're going to look after your property. And the furnishing aspect is something that is worth considering. Outside of the fact that most tenants don't have furniture, the first impressions factor of seeing a fully dressed property is far more appealing when you're doing a search on Rightmove than if it's just an empty property with magnolia walls. You're going to get far more interest. We actually did. It was actually a property of mine that we did a few months ago that I just refurbished, and by creating that show home look with the beds made, table laid, sofas and all that type of stuff, generated 4 times more inquiries than when we did it without any furniture in there. So that first impressions factor is really important when increased the amount of inquiries that you get from tenants because presentation is really, really, really important. And I think being actively involved, self-managing your properties is really a smart thing to do. It allows us to understand if there's any issues with our property, and any of those little things turning into big issues and requiring extensive works can be dealt with quickly and efficiently right at the very beginning. And also ensuring that we're getting the rent paid on time and staying on top of it all is really, really important. So hopefully that all makes sense. I think we've got time for a few questions. There's been quite a few that have come through, and I'm just going to have a look at some of them that I can see have come through. So just give me 2 seconds to just bring these up on the screen, and I'll try and get through as much of them as we possibly can. Just a few people asking about the wear and tear tax break that exists. So when you fill out your self-assessment tax return, which for the year 13-14 needs to be done by the end of January, you go through the process of putting in your rent and what your interest payments have been, what your rates and service charges, etc., and if you have selected the option that you have let on a furnished basis, there is the option then of declaring 10 or using the 10% wear and tear allowance that exists, and that 10% is off the annual rent, and every year you can use it. So if your annual rental income is 10 grand per annum, you can reduce your tax liability by £1,000 against what tax will be owed. So if you, in this scenario, if your rent is £10,000, if your interest payments on your mortgage are 2.5, rates and preparing your tax return and letting fees and all of that, so there's another £1,000, you could add your 10% wear and tear of another £1,000 on there, reducing your tax liability of what you pay on. So hopefully that answers your question. There's a few that came in on that basis. I'm not a qualified accountant, but that is how that particular rule operates. There's a few people that are asking about sending the reminders out for the rent and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and sometimes it's a bit on top of things and a bit harassing. There is a balance. We don't want to be driving our tenants mad, but at the end of the day, I think there's an argument that it's just good practice to just send out reminders. I go on trains quite a lot, and the train line, for example, sends a reminder to me the day before about my journey tomorrow, and on there what my train times are, and make sure I remember my travel card, etc., etc. And I just think it's really, really useful. You know, if you think it's going to hassle your tenants and annoy them, and that they're just going to pay on time, you know, anyway, then you've got no problems. And I think it depends on who your tenants are, but I think it's a good practice thing to do, and allows you to keep on top of what's going on. And certainly it just prevents, you know, rent arrears occurring, and just nipping things in the bud. So I think it's good practice is probably where I'm coming from. There's a few people talking about presentation and saying, yep, I can see it makes sense. You know, you're increasing the amount of inquiries. If you ever do a search for rental properties in your area on the Rightmove app using your phone, you will see, all you see on the screen are the photographs of the property. There's no words, there's no description. It's just that main photograph. And so if you're able to make your photograph look better than all the others by making it look fully furnished rather than just an empty room, you're going to get more interest, more inquiries, and we mentioned earlier about being able to achieve a higher rental too. But a few people have said, you know, what do I do with the storage? You know, moving things around, don't people have stuff? Well, what we're finding, and I appreciate this is a national picture, and it's going to obviously vary area by area, is that increasingly tenants don't have their stuff. You know, they increasingly have very few belongings, you know, laptop and a couple of other electronic toys, and yes, they may go to IKEA or the likes at the start of the tenancy to get various bits and bobs, but that type of furniture is not there to last. It's not like a lifetime purchase. It's purely for that particular tenancy, and it's unlikely they will take it with them when they move forward. So I've found personally, and through Upad, that it's very rare that tenants want furniture moved out. That said, yes, you do need somewhere to put it all. I personally have a couple of lockups that I use, and you know, I have spent quite a lot of weekends moving stuff around, but I think the hassle factor isn't as great as we make out it to be, and the benefit of doing fully furnished totally outweighs the unfurnished in terms of the additional income we can get and the more inquiries that we get through from tenants. But again, what works in your area and what you're willing to do is going to have a steer on whether it's something that that you go down. A couple of people asking, saying I've got an HMO property, or I let out various rooms, and sort of thoughts on that perspective. I think everything we've sort of talked about, the same sort of thing applies, and certainly as far as the furnishings, more applies when you're letting out individual rooms, that people are less likely to have their own stuff. So that probably is more relevant than something else. And I think from our experience, the transitional nature of tenants on a room that are renting a room basis are higher, and therefore you'll need to set realistic rents. The need to stay on top of rent days, and making sure you set reminders is probably more relevant than ever before. There's been a couple of people asking questions that I don't think we should answer in terms of best ways of getting a mortgage on a HMO property and licensing. And we are a letting agent. We represent the whole of the UK, and I know stuff about mortgages and licensing. Increasingly, local councils have compulsory or voluntary licensing in place, and I think that aspect you should be speaking to your local council to see whether it's a legal thing or a recommendation thing. One thing we do notice is that if you put in your advert that you are members of an association like the Residential Landlord Association, or a member of the London Landlord Accreditation Scheme, etc., you're actually going to appeal to more tenants because they think that you are an accredited landlord with more respect. And that, combined with saying that you're doing the viewings and managing the property, is going to create a lot more interest for you from tenants than by not mentioning those things. So consider those particular aspects. A couple of people are asking of where do you get furniture from. Now, I would go for ease. There's a company called Loft Interiors. You can look them up online. What I like about them is that they have packages available. So if you've got a 1-bedroom or a 3-bedroom property, they have packs that's available. and you can choose your level, whether it's a student property or quite upmarket in terms of the quality of product that you get, and you can choose those. They pretty much come and get it all delivered within a day or so, and they also get it all fitted for you, so you don't have to get your screwdriver out. So consider those things. I've personally used them a few times. I think they're a good bunch of guys, and they cover the whole of the UK. A couple of people saying, what if tenants don't like the furniture? Well, don't be too fussy. I think try and answer that by not getting furniture that is either your own old stuff that you don't want anymore, and try and go for quite neutral colours. Have a look at what new home developers are doing in your area and how they're presenting stuff, and have a look at what's the most sort of common ranges that are being purchased in stores like IKEA and what have you, to see what is the most popular. But generally try and stick with quite neutral things. Sort of gloss white in kitchens clearly is quite popular, and sort of dark greys in bedrooms is from what I understand quite mainstream, and try and appeal to those things rather than trying to be too wacky and out there. Just conscious of the time, I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions, and then I think we should call it a day. Let me just have a quick look on here. Sorry, I'm just trying to read these things. A couple of people are asking what is happening in the marketplace in terms of students versus couples, sharers and families. The two biggest things we've noticed are the growth of single-person households and the growth of families that are also looking to rent outside of two-bed flats, for example, and that's been the biggest change that we've seen in the recent months. Families increasingly sort of, whether it's a schools thing and trying to get into a catchment area, or whether they've sold a place and they're trying to haven't found somewhere to move to and put them in pole position by being cash buyers, are increasingly renting to sort of fill that stock gap. And those are the two biggest sectors that we've seen. One thing to consider with families is that increasingly families have pets. About half of all families have a pet of some sort, and so you should consider that, because most landlords won't let to pets as long as you put precautions in place that the property needs to be cleaned professionally afterwards, maybe a higher bond for any damage. You could actually charge a bit higher rent than you otherwise would, and appeal to what is in effect quite a lot of tenants out there that are quite restricted on stock, because most people won't let to them. And I think the final question that we've had, people just saying, furnished properties, is this just not more hassle, more complication of dealing with stuff and what have you? Is it worth it? And I think at the end of the day, you've got to look, if you're able to let a property really quickly at a good rent without having to furnishing it, fine, no problem. But if you create an alert yourself on Rightmove or Zoopla, so you've got a steer of what's happening in your locality, if the other properties that are being advertised are maybe being advertised at a slightly higher rent or are fully furnished, have a look at them. Do they look more appealing if you were a tenant than what yours would look like? And is it going to be worth the investment? And I think you're the best person to give a solid answer to about whether it's worth it or not. But have a look at what the competition are doing, i.e. the people that have got a similar type of property in your vicinity. See what rents are being achieved. And actually just ask your own tenants when they're coming round, what furniture have you got? Do you have a bed? Do you have white goods? Do you have a dining room table? Ask them those sort of things so you can make an informed decision about whether it's something you should go down rather than rushing into it. And I think, take all those considerations into account, and that should give you a steer on what you should do. Let's call it an evening. There's quite a few more questions I can see that have come through, but I think it's probably sensible to draw an end there. I hope everybody found it really useful and have at least got a few sound bites of stuff they can put into their day-to-day lives going forward. Thank you very much for listening. There's going to be an email that's going to come out shortly after this, where you can put your feedback in, which I would really appreciate. What other topics could we include further down the line? what could we improve on, what your thoughts on this have been, whether there's any other landlords that you think that are friends of yours that you think would be worth watching this webinar, which we've done a few times now, and we've got new dates in January when we'll be doing it again, so it'd be good if there's anybody you would recommend, and then yeah, any feedback would be much appreciated. In the meantime, have a wonderful festive period. Thank you very much for taking the trouble of listening, and enjoy the rest of your evening. All the very best, and happy Christmas.